Thanks ever so much for the introduction and also for the invitation to come and speak with you guys today. A slightly different tact on what evidence is and using evidence to inform the work we do, where we're going to look at the field of anti-doping. I think it's fair to say that all of us in anti-doping primarily are working for the clean athletes. That's our focus, but in doing that, we have to identify and find out what the cheating athlete is doing and put ourselves in the best position to catch those cheats. So for those of you that are perhaps not familiar with the environment of anti-doping, just a bit of background around the structure. The kind of top organization that's ensuring global harmonization and is setting the rule book for us all to follow is the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA. And it's the World Anti-Doping Code that you can see up there on the left-hand side that filters down to ourselves as the National Anti-Doping Organization, through to our sports, the national governing bodies of sports, and eventually down to the athlete. And that's the rules and regulations that they have to abide by. So we, as the National Anti-Doping Organisation, UK Anti-Doping, report to the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and we're accountable to government, and we're responsible for doing all the drug testing here in the UK. And then alongside that, we have our international federations that in the specific sports they deal with will have a responsibility to do drug testing as well. As an organisation, UK Anti-Doping was formed at the back end of 2009, and it's got four key functions that we operate with. We have the Operations Directorate, which is the real hands-on, so that's our testing team, setting up the tests on which athletes, when to go, how to collect the sample, and when to ship it to the laboratory for analysis. Then we've got in-house legal that's very important to ensure that we can prosecute a case if we ever find something in an individual's sample. Communications and education speaks for itself, but if we're working for the clean athletes, one thing we have to make sure is that they're aware of those rules and regulations and fully informed about their rights and responsibilities. And then we've got the back-end business support, which makes sure that, as you guys are trying to do, we are as efficient as possible with the processes that we use and that we follow. To give you a flavour for the scope of the organisation, you can see up on the screen there all the different number of sports that we're involved in. So it ranges from your top-end professional sports with huge amounts of money, millions of pounds worth of contracts involved, through to perhaps those lesser sports where the individual is working their full-time 9 to 5 and in addition doing some serious hard training to try and strive to achieve their gold medals. When I was given the subject of evidence in anti-doping, I first did some self-reflection around our organisation, and it's a really interesting dichotomy that we find ourselves in as to assessing our effectiveness and our own performance. If we just look at the numbers, we do 7,500 tests and we get a positive finding rate of about just under 1%. Now the question there is that really good, effective education that means no athletes want to cheat? Or is it poor detection of those that are cheating and not actually finding out what's going on? We strive to ensure that what we do in both those areas is as efficient, as effective as possible. And what I'm going to move on to is how we actually use evidence in the more specific operational aspects of our work to inform our day-to-day activities. So before I do that, it's important to flag how an athlete might actually be prosecuted under the anti-doping rules and regulations. So it's not just a case of finding something in their urine or blood sample that they shouldn't be taking. There's a number of different anti-doping rule violations that you can see up on the screen there, many of which, and the ones I've highlighted down the bottom in red, require investigative evidence from email exchanges, police communication that we have. So it's not just about sample analysis, having the right diagnostic test. We actually have the evidence base that you're using forensically as well. And the first place we try and use the evidence, as I say, is to ensure that we've got a strong prevention program. We use our athlete education pathway because we can't use the same information and the same styles to educate athletes that are at different stages of that pathway. And we need to understand what their needs are, what their level of competition and their current understanding of anti-doping is, so we can best educate them. And what we do is we do a baseline education survey on a regular basis to understand the current situation in the UK, those key influencers that may be able to support the athletes that we see up on the screen, and the best way in which we can get our messages across to them. And one good example is that there was a study over in the US where they looked at who the athlete was most likely to turn to for help and support. And it was pretty resounding that the answer from that survey came out as coaches. And then the follow-up was to ask coaches what their perception and understanding of anti-doping was, and 30% of coaches in this survey stated that they felt or their understanding was that athletes either were likely to or needed to cheat in order to achieve. So you've got 30% of coaches who are the key influencers of the athletes. So we needed to make sure that we influence the coaches to correctly educate the athletes. So we established with the Sports Coach UK team that manages all of the coaching across the UK to set up a Coach Clean campaign and an online education tool for those guys to use, which is a real key in terms of driving where we spend our money and where we put our focus. Another area where we gather evidence and information is with our intelligence team. This is integral to our organisation that we're intelligence-led, and we have relationships with Customs, Borders, the Serious Organised Crime Association, and we have this tool, Report Doping in Sport, where anyone that is aware of or believes that there's doping taking place in sport can anonymously report that information to us, and we follow a 5x5 police structure in terms of how we deal with that report before we act on it. And then we have our options available to us as to how we're going to take action against the information that we receive. So that's a really good source of information and evidence for ourselves. And then in my particular area, science and medicine, we have a lot of questions that we need answers to, and we try and address those in numerous different ways. Up on the screen there's a few examples. So substance profiles is something we're trying to harmonize across the world. What's the drug? Why is it being used? When's it being used? How's the athlete likely to cheat with it? If we can answer all those questions and understand the physiology of the athlete and the pharmacology of the substance, then we're better placed to catch someone that might be cheating with that particular drug. Sports categorization. We need to spend our money as efficiently as possible, so we prioritize and we have a categorization process that basically risk assesses the sports. And we go through each individual sport, how they might benefit from taking a performance-enhancing substance, and make those judgments so we're spending our monies and our time and resource effectively. Athlete profiling, where we go from taking a population-based measure and actually starting to judge the athlete against their own individual readings and parameters so that we can see abnormalities more easily, more quickly, and perhaps act on those. The prohibited list I'll go into a little bit more detail shortly. And then therapeutic use. Athletes need medication. Sometimes those medications are prohibited, but we can't just say, yep, no problems, go ahead and take it. There's a process where they have to provide us with evidence of their diagnoses and the clinical assessment and treatments that they're having to receive before they can get that exemption. And then an area that we're looking to develop, and it's interesting to hear some of the presentations already today, is how we can use scientific research to enhance what we do within anti-doping. So to touch a little bit further on the prohibited list, to explain what it is, it's one single list that operates across all sports. And it's telling you, in short, what an athlete can and can't take. But not only is it substances, it's methods as well. So what procedures can and can't they follow? So the best example is blood doping, where they're taking out a bag of blood, whacking it in storage, waiting to recover, and then putting it back in at a time that's pertinent to their competition. That's a method that's prohibited in sport. There's a split on the prohibited list differentiating between in competition and out of competition. So some substances are banned all of the time, other substances are only banned in competition. And by in competition we mean 12 hours, generally the rule is 12 hours before the competition of that particular individual. And if a substance is found within their sample on a test that's collected on that day, regardless of when they took it, that would constitute an anti-doping rule violation. Then we also differentiate between substances that might have a non-doping plausible non-doping explanation and those that don't. And that's the specified and non-specified. What that allows us to do is with the specified substances, we have a greater flexibility in our sanctions that we provide to the athletes. Anything from a warning and reprimand, an actual no time out of the sport, through to a 2-year ban. For the non-specified, you're starting at 2 years because of the seriousness or the perceived seriousness of the substance. And finally, just a small touch that this is assessed against some specific criteria, and it doesn't differentiate between society and sport. Once it's decided that it's banned, this particular substance or method will be prohibited. This is the approval process that's followed to reassess the prohibited list on an annual basis currently. So the list committee will meet, they'll consult with organisations like ourselves, and we in turn will consult with the UK experts and general populace to get information around what we think the prohibited list should look like and how it should be shaped. That then goes through to the Health, Medical and Science Committee at the World Anti-Doping Agency, and finally there'll be sign-off at the Executive Committee, whereby the list will be published on October 1st, there or thereabouts, ready for implementation on January 1st of the following year. In terms of the information that has to be checked for a substance or a method to be prohibited, it has to meet 2 of the following 3 criteria. So is that substance potentially or does enhance the athlete's sporting performance? Is there an actual or a potential health risk to the athlete? And does the use of the substance or the method violate the spirit of sport? And that's another area that at the moment it's 2 of 3, and there's a lot of debate in the world of anti-doping around how do you gather the evidence for those 3 criteria, and which of those 3 criteria should we be putting our emphasis on, or should we be treating them all equally? Which is where I'd like to get the voting buttons out and ask your opinion with regards to those 3 criteria. And particularly I'm referring to the 3rd one, if we go back. The use violates the spirit of sport. Like I say, currently a substance just has to meet 2 out of the 3. For the violation of the spirit of sport, do you in the audience perceive this criteria as not particularly important and it could be removed as a criteria? It is important, we'll keep it as it is, and it's one of the checks of the 3, or actually it's that important that we should be prioritizing this criteria above the other 2. Okay, so the majority, or just over half, perceive it to be important, we'll keep it as it is, and 33% of you see it as extremely important and should be prioritized as a criteria. Not many see it as not important. If we compare that with a survey that we did in the UK this year, with our stakeholders that we work with within sport, it was probably actually the opposite way around. You know, the majority are still seeing it as extremely important, but out of the 3 criteria, it was the one that received the most number of votes for being not important. So it's interesting for us as an organisation to gather this feedback to identify how we should manage the prohibited list. Another question that I'd be interested in your opinion is, I've just explained that some substances are prohibited at certain times, the rest all the time. Do you think that that's right as it currently stands, or should all substances be prohibited at all times if they're perceived to be banned? About 50-50. So I can't take that one back and argue in either particular direction. But again, some useful information for us to gather, and this is the sort of information we're trying to gather from our key stakeholders. The 3rd and final one that I'd be interested in your thoughts on is, as described, the list is reviewed on an annual basis. There is the argument that that doesn't give us, as the anti-doping world, enough time to do the relevant investigative work and research to gather data around particular substances or methods to contribute to those decisions. So should we keep it as an annual basis, or should we actually extend it and change the list only once every 3 years? So it looks like the majority believe that we keep it as it is. So in terms of 2012, to give a summary of our opinion around the prohibited list, based on the evidence that we've gathered to date and the information that we feel is available, we've asked a few key questions around the prohibited list. We've said that there needs to be greater consistency around inhaled beta-2 agonists. At the moment, some are prohibited, Some are prohibited with thresholds and some aren't prohibited. So there's a real challenge around the management of inhaled beta-2 agonists, and we're keen to see some greater consistency with regards to that. We've suggested that currently some stimulants are in the non-specified group, so the instant sanction for an athlete is 2 years. We've argued that there should be greater flexibility for those stimulants because there may be a non-doping, plausible explanation as to why that particular substance was in their system. We feel that for us to gain the most information around the work we do, we need to monitor the substances quite often in advance of them being on the prohibited list. We need to gather as much information out of those elite athlete urine and blood samples as we possibly can, see what the trends are, do some analysis of those trends, and then make some decisions around whether we should be prohibiting them or not. And finally, we're in favor of ensuring that the list is kind of streamlined as best as it possibly can be to ensure that our focus is on the cheating athletes and we don't spend too much time prosecuting the ones that haven't got the information or have perhaps been a little bit stupid with regards to their behaviours and their responsibilities for anti-doping. To summarise some of the changes which I thought might be interesting for you, in 2012 we're seeing formoterol, one of those inhaled beta-2s, change its status from prohibited to having a threshold. So I think it's 36 micrograms over a 24-hour period is now the accepted threshold. Anything above that, it's still prohibited. Philpressin was prohibited and now has been added as an exception to say it's not, and that's principally due to the feedback from the medical community. There's been some clarity around glycerol. Glycerol is prohibited in sport, but people were inquiring, well, how can you do that because it's in all foodstuffs, it's pretty much omnipresent. How do we establish what are you actually trying to prohibit? Some clarity was provided that actually it's high doses of glycerol that are used intravenously to affect the plasma volumes that are actually being prohibited in sport, not the stuff that you get in your cake as a result of having your coffee break just moments ago. And a couple of sport-specific changes as well, where alcohol and beta blockers were previously prohibited in specific sports, and that's been removed from those sports as of January 1st, 2012.